Good afternoon, good evening, all. Welcome to our Environment and Peace session. Great to see so many of our zone and district leaders on this call tonight. I'm Ingrid Neitsch, Regional Rotary Foundation Coordinator for Zone 28, and my colleague, Eileen is the Regional Rotary Foundation Coordinator for Zone 32. We are delighted that we have over 300 registrants for this call tonight, indicating such strong interest in this topic. And our members are here from all corners of our zone. We want to acknowledge that we have members of our foundation teams. Our Assistant Regional Rotary Foundation Coordinators are with us, as well as some NPOL representatives, Endowment Major Gift Advisors, and also, I believe, a couple of Rotary staff. So why a session on environment and peace? Well, peace is the cornerstone of Rotary's mission, and the environment is Rotary's newest areas of focus. So that's two good reasons right there. However, there are some extenuating circumstances, which I will highlight a little bit later, that led us to this event. You know, I believe in continuous learning, and your attendance on this call tonight demonstrates your commitment to lifelong learning as well. So thank you for being here. Last week, UNESCO marked the International Day of Education. Some of you may be aware of the International Baccalaureate program that was created in Switzerland for international mobile students. That program is now available in over 5,000 schools located in 150 countries. Part of my life before Rotary. I bring it to our attention tonight because the International Baccalaureate Global Community set a theme for the International Day of Education. And the theme is learning for lasting peace. I just thought that was perfect. Learning for lasting peace. And their mission is to develop caring, knowledgeable individuals to foster a more peaceful world through education. We embrace the concept that sustaining peace needs ongoing action. It's not a destination, but a journey. Tonight's session will bring a unique perspective to the connections between environment and peace. This is truly a learning session, and our outstanding speakers will be introduced shortly. But right now, it is my privilege to introduce our Rotary International Director, Drew Kessler. Drew is a Senior Vice President with the Commercial Real Estate Division, managing a large portfolio in the New York area. Along with his successful career, Drew is also a trailblazer in Rotary. Married to his lovely wife, Vicky, and father of 5 children, he manages to incorporate his family in his many Rotary activities and travels. I don't know how he does it, but they all seem happy whenever I see them. So we are so appreciative, Drew, that you're taking time to be with us tonight and bring greetings. Over to you.
Ingrid, thank you very much. And how we do it is they're extremely well trained, but that's for another meeting and another day. So first and foremost, I don't want to take too much time because we have a really amazing speaker lineup for tonight. But I want to just recognize some folks and put credit where credit is due. First to Ingrid and her team, thank you so much for putting this night together. But this night, I will tell you, is possible because of an event we had, and I'm sure Ingrid's going to talk about it a little bit later, at the beginning of September, where we had Life on Land in Anchorage, Alaska. Diane Fegis, who is our chair, as well as the entire, if you will, Alaskan contingent, did such an incredible job putting on a world-class symposium in which you have 2 speakers tonight that provided a presentation similar to this live to us in Anchorage. That was just second to none. I've been to my fair share of conventions and conferences, as I know many on this call have been, and the speaker lineup and the delivery that we had back in September was absolutely outstanding, incredible. And this tonight, Michele and Marty gave a highlight presentation back in September, which I think Ingrid took and ran with it and said, we have to do this again and have more people see and hear the opportunity that was presented. So with that, I just want to really provide my thanks to all that made this happen, to Liz in the background, to Bruce and Sue for always, taking care of our technology. Really appreciate it. To Michele and Marty, before you guys speak, just know how grateful I am that you're providing this content and this information to our team, because it's the folks that are on this call that are going to bring it back to our districts and our clubs and really make change possible. So thank you all. As always, thank you all for what you do in the name of Rotary. I look forward to seeing you hopefully in the coming months on the Rotary Road.
Thank you, Drew. Michele and Marty did such an amazing job of their keynote speakers in Alaska that it was hard to pull an end to the session. And so after the session was over, we had numerous requests. We need to keep this going. We need some ongoing dialogue about the environment and peace. So Marty and I and others deliberated and decided that we would offer this virtual session on this important topic. And thankfully, Michele was on board as well. So that's how we got here today. I'd like to just make a few introductory comments about Michele. It's quite the bio. Dr. Michele Devlin is a professor of environmental security at the United States Army War College and professor of Arctic Health and Human Security with National Science Foundation's UN Arctic Center. She's a doctor of public health, a registered nurse, and an emergency medical technician. Dr. Devlin's specialty areas include the circumpolar human terrain of the high north, environmental migrants, civil military response to climate disasters, indigenous populations, and cross-cultural engagement with diverse and underserved populations. She has spent 6 months living above the Arctic Circle and has recently traveled to Antarctica. Michele has provided technical assistance on cross-cultural issues to thousands of military members and first responders. She's been deployed with the American Red Cross to Haiti and the Philippines, has served with the U.S. Army during Operation Freedom as a lead human terrain social scientist in Afghanistan. She's also a published author of 150 articles and books. As you can imagine, Michele is a recipient of many awards and honors, including the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame, one Iowa Award, Civil Rights Award, and other teaching, scholarship, and service awards. On behalf of our zone and district leaders on this call, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Michele Devlin.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much, Ingrid and Drew, Marty and Diane, and the entire group. I feel like I'm part of your Rotarian family at this point. I can talk about climate migrants forever, and it's so awesome that I keep getting asked by your Rotarians to come, to come have meetings with them and to help you kind of think out some of these issues as you take a look at areas you might want to impact or get involved in. So what I'm doing with Marty, basically I'm setting up Marty to follow me. To give you sort of and this is an abbreviated view of what we did up in Alaska together back in the fall. So I kind of want to give you a brief overview of what climate migration is all about, what the big trends are that we're seeing globally, what some of the definitions are. It's a field, it's a discipline that does have its own terms. And then again, talk to you about some of the big trends and strategies that we look at globally to try to address climate migration issues. Again, basically, I'm setting up the meeting for you so that Marty can take over, follow me, and talk to you about the role of Rotary and the International Rotarians in these issues. So with that, go ahead and begin. And climate migration, and by the way, that's a photo of Kwajalein and the heavy wave activity there. I was there on a research sabbatical a few years ago, but if you Google Marshall Islands, extreme wave, Kwajalein, Army base, you'll see some very interesting footage of an extreme wave emergency situation that just happened a few days ago there that we're working on. Next, please. And that's all very relevant to your meeting this evening. So something to keep in mind as you work on these projects, You will hear the phrase climate migrants, climate refugees pretty commonly in the lay media, the public. Technically speaking, there is no such thing. There is no official definition of climate refugees. They are not entitled to any set of humanitarian, legal humanitarian aid, resettlement benefits, things like that, generally speaking, around the world. The phrase that we're trying to use more appropriately would be EDPs, or environmentally displaced persons, there on your screen. And when you think of climate migrants, just understand that it's a very complex system of push factors sending people away from where they live, and pull factors attracting them to other areas. Climate at this point, overall globally, is what we consider, what I call at the War College, a migration amplifier. It is not yet, in most cases, the main or single cause of human migration. It is one of a number. We tend to see economic issues, people look, pull factors, people wanting better economic opportunities elsewhere, push factors of conflict and violence, but climate is increasingly involved and interwoven in all of that. It's linked to political instability, bad economies, social disparities in communities where they're leaving and where they're being pushed from. There are different reports and different estimates, but we're thinking that anywhere from about 200 million to roughly 1 billion people on Earth could be climate migrants by 2050. That's the standard statistic you'll see a lot. I have to tell you, as someone who has worked with climate migrants on the ground, as well as taught about them in a number of countries, I believe that this figure is underreported and underestimated. I can tell you that I've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of climate migrants already in the United States and in other countries. And it's because of the way we define it that we're undercounting. And I'll explain that in a moment. That's a photo actually of the Philippines Typhoon Yolanda, mega typhoon, hurricane category 6, technically doesn't even exist, back from 2013, I believe, when I responded there with the Red Cross. Next, please. Again, some photos there from Hurricane Yolanda, the typhoon in the Philippines. Basically, environmental migration, environmentally displaced persons. What we're seeing, there are disparities going on in the countries that they come from, locations that they go to, and in the recipient and resettlement communities. These tend to be diverse and underserved populations. Basically, those that can get out do. Those that have more money and opportunity have stronger places to live and more resiliency options. Those that are poor don't, and they tend to be disproportionately represented as environmental migrants, both in terms of people leaving and then coming into other communities. Also with climate migrants, environmental migrants, these tend to be complex, slow onset disasters. It can take years for people to make a decision to leave where they live because of climate issues. It's very different from a mega earthquake, let's say, or a war. Think back to the Ukrainian war. Millions of people, several million people fled the Ukraine. You probably all saw pictures. That happened with a matter of days or weeks. Climate migration is much slower, and it is, again, one of many factors intertwined pushing people to leave. It is a migration amplifier again. So remember that when you look at that, and that's why we're undercounting them. We're using war refugee models to try to understand environmental displacement and migration. War is usually fast. The environmental disasters tend to be much slower. Also, interestingly, from a disparity standpoint, I know you folks work on gender issues too. We do see women, females, 14 times more likely to die in disasters and 80% more likely to be displaced by climate issues. You can interweave some of your gender efforts in with this as well. And this is usually because women and children do make up the bulk of poor, lower income populations in the world. Some of it is culture. Maybe they are less likely to know how to swim, to escape from a typhoon, for instance, or big waves and tsunamis. They may wear more traditional clothes, heavy wraps and things like that, that may not be conducive for surviving some disasters. Anyway, there is a gender component. So next thing to be aware of, these are the main categories of environmental migrants to be aware of and what happens to them. By far, currently, and even to 2050 and beyond, most likely we expect environmental migrants, climate migrants, to be internally displaced. In other words, they leave a town or community in their own country. If you could back that up, please, for a moment, please. Thanks. If they leave an area within their own country and then stay in their own country. We see this in the United States. I worked with I responded to Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. I was amazed to be working with people that moved from Louisiana during Hurricane Katrina. They bought homes in low-lying floodplains in Houston. They got flooded out and had to move again in Hurricane Harvey. They were regularly displaced. That's the most common model all over the world. Now, in some cases, the push factors are so severe and they go on for so long, some may have opportunities to go to other countries. In many cases, they work as frankly, a cheap labor source in a resettlement country, could be nearby, or another nation. They may or may not be recognized as legal or official migrants or refugees. You can get social disparities in the home nation because it can leave you with a brain drain. And again, the ones with money get out, the ones that don't are left. And then it can also leave you with disparities in the resettlement country. Although a lot of times we see these folks sending remittances back home to their families, extended families, that can help that home country. And then some of the worst cases we see are what we call managed retreat, forced retreat. Basically, there is a location against the will of the population, but they forcibly have to go. It's no longer viable to keep them in that town, in that village, in that neighborhood, in that settlement. We're seeing this already in the United States. Places like the little indigenous village of Kivalina up in northern Alaska. I'm working on a big project now in Kwajalein with the Marshall Islands and the Marshallese trying to stay there, but life is getting very difficult with climate damage. Kiribati in the Pacific, they're looking to relocate their entire country to higher ground in the Pacific. That's pretty frightening and amazing. Western China, it can be linked to political issues and conflict issues as well. Forced resettlement of minorities against their will. So you can get into a lot of complications also. Next, please. Some special considerations, again, as you think about projects you might want to get involved in with your groups. Again, please think of climate as a migration amplifier. It will vary by location. Again, the indigenous folks up in Kivalina, it is a much more serious issue than people living in Albion, Iowa. Okay, Kwajalein, the Marshall Islands, much more significant issues than people maybe living in Edmonton. All right, so it's going to depend. You want to know your local community, your local population, who you may or may not be receiving and working with, or who you may be funding or helping in a different country or community. So lots of disparities, lots of differences. In general, we cannot use war refugee models to understand climate migration. It's a different thing. Climate migration, again, is slower, it's complex, it's intertwined with many issues. A lot of times social scientists will do interviews with migrants. They'll say, hey, why are you coming to this country? Why are you leaving your border, leaving another place, going into a different country? And the most common reason people will say, well, because of work and the economy. We need a better economy. We need better economic opportunities. And then they stop the conversation. They don't ask enough questions. What they need to do is continue to talk with these people. What is it about your home community in the economy that is so bad that makes you want to risk your life and everything else to go into a different country or a different place to live. And a lot of times then you'll get into climate issues. They may say, well, you know what, we're peasants, we're farmers. We have had very volatile weather for years now, heavy drought for many years, and then extreme flooding for a number of years. We have fungus and mildew on our crops. We couldn't get loans. We couldn't have our crop production. We left for 3 or 4 or 5 other communities. We got exposed to urban cartels, racketeering, drug issues. We feared for our lives. We ultimately decided we need to leave. So it can be, in the military, we call it second and third order effects of climate and climate insecurity. It could be 100 different steps down the line before they actually get into a different community. So make sure we spend time talking and meeting with these folks and understanding the role of environmental insecurity in their decisions to migrate. Again, and when we look at human migration, there are push factors and there are pull factors with climate. Next, please. So I wanted to show you just a few photographs again of a couple of projects that I've been working very closely on before I turn it over to Marty. But I think these can help bring home the reality of what this stuff looks like when you're out in the field. So I wanted to show you again a little bit from a case from the Marshall Islands, middle of the Pacific, and how these folks ended up in rural Iowa, the rural Midwest of the United States, as ice packers and meat packers. Next, please. So you may know that the Marshall Islands, they are an independent country of several dozen islands that are out there in the middle of the Pacific, roughly 5 hours west of Hawaii, and then another 5 hours out to Australia in the North Pacific. Next, please. And if you look at that recolored photograph, a lot of you probably recognize that, of nuclear testing that the American military did out in the remote Pacific areas like the Marshall Islands. I bet a bunch of you saw Oppenheimer, the movie, recently, and nuclear war and the legacy of nuclear testing in the 60s, but that was done out there on Bikini Atoll and parts of the Marshall Islands. They were selected to test there because you are literally in the middle of nowhere. And in terms of a human density, very, very small number of humans live there. But unfortunately, that is where the Marshallese live. That was their home. Next, please. Because of that, because of the damage we did with the Americans and the legacy there, and it was a territory and all of that, they're now an independent country. These folks can come and work legally in the United States under the COFA Treaty, like the Palauans and like a number of the Micronesians. But most interesting, they live on very remote, low-lying atoll, sandy islands in the middle of the Pacific. A lot of those islands in the Marshalls are only about 6 feet above sea level. And so you have a lot of damage with overwash, extreme waves. Again, you can Google that if you want to see one that did damage the other day on Roy Namor and Kwajalein, more frequent storms. You have sea level rise down the road. It's happening already, getting worse. Saltwater intrusion into the drinking water, poor soil quality, can't really grow food there anymore. Sewage systems, damage to that with the overwash, saltwater infiltration, sea level rise, and subsidence, overuse of fresh water. And so you have all these issues converging. So because of that, a lot of them now, because they can legally do so, you've got big economic pull factors to get them into the US. Some of our for-profit companies do recruit them, and from other states as secondary migrants. They are a source of unskilled labor in the American Midwest, where you have a decline in population, lower fertility levels, and outmigration of our young. Next, please. And if you go back just one for a second, that's you can see those atolls. That was like a few years ago when I was there. They were already going underwater, and now it's even worse. Next, please. That's the airport in the capital city in Majuro. You can see that over there. That is overwash. That's ocean water that has come up periodically onto the runway, and they have to keep a lot of sandbags there and lots of different problems. Next, please. A little causeway between one of the islands with the workers that are the labor force in Kwajalein on the American base there and going out to another atoll. Look at the level of the lagoon and the ocean and that little road and the overwash. That's how close they are to becoming uninhabitable at times. By 2035, they're expected to become uninhabitable due to being under too much overwash, sea level rise, saltwater intrusion. Next, please. Again, that's where the workers live. That's the island of Ebi. It's very dense. About 14,000 people live there in very tight quarters. Some of them take a little ferry over to Kwajalein to work on the base. It's very difficult living again. You can see the ocean is right there to their houses. So imagine when you get large waves and overwash, let alone sea level rise and saltwater intrusion and all of that. Next, please. Again, you can see that is the beach. You saw the ocean, and those are the seawalls that have been built in past years, but they often do not withstand the increasingly violent and more frequent winds and storms. A lot of them were putting up, corrugated tin siding and just, figure out it's easier just to put that back up. Next, please. And that is Ebi. That's one of the atolls in the Marshall Islands. That is ocean water in the neighborhood from overwash and larger waves that came up. Very, very common occurrence. Again, this was several years ago. This is happening much worse now. Next, please. And because of that, as you saw some of the Marshall Island pictures, so those folks they can work legally in the US, and they do. I worked with them for about 10 years or more in the state of Iowa, where I was a professor previously. Prior to the Army War College, I worked with them on health issues, resettlement, education, housing. They were very much a disaffected population, but very resilient. They are rebuilding their country in key communities in the Midwest, often around companies that employ them in warehousing, ice packing, meat packing jobs where they don't initially need a lot of English language or skills. And then the other case study I'll show you with some photographs, and then I'll turn it over to Marty. So this is a case of the Philippines. Next, please. I did deploy there back in 2013 with the Red Cross, the international component of the American Red Cross, and we were assisting with shelter and health and assessment and food and all kinds of issues. Philippines are out there. Yet again, another Asian country like the Marshall Islands, severely impacted by environmental degradation. Next, please. So Typhoon Yolanda happened. If we had a category for it, it would have been a category 6, considered a super typhoon. We are more concerned about these now with warming of the ocean, unstable and different wind and sea patterns, and these are happening more frequently. What actually ended up causing them the severe damage was the storm surge in the bay off of Tacloban. Basically, it functioned like a tidal wave. It was a storm surge, and that ocean out of that bay, that shallow water, lifted up 20 to 60 feet, came on in, and just flooded everything around Tacloban and sort of central Philippines quite a ways. I came there a month after it happened. They were still finding dead bodies. God forbid. It was horrific. There were people all over. I've never been to anything so horrific. There were mass graves that they were having to put bodies in just to deal with the emergency situation. They ultimately were able to reconnect those bodies to their family members through DNA testing, but anywhere from 63 to even 8,000 people died fairly quickly that day. About 5 million had no food, about 4 million homeless. Next, please. And that is that mega typhoon. As you can see, it was happening. There were predictions, and sure enough, it did hit central Philippines there. Next, please. And that's what it looked like when I got there a month later. That was a massive cargo ship just lifted up out of the ocean and carried in with the storm surge right on top of town. You can see it destroyed everything. And that level of destruction I saw for hours outside of Tacloban. It was phenomenal what happened. I think they ultimately had like 200-mile-an-hour winds that lasted, I forget, a whole day or something. It was ridiculous. So you got all the damage of a mega windstorm with the ocean flooding. It was horrible. And dead bodies were everywhere, by the way, within that rubble and within the ship and under the ship, even when I was there. Next, please. Again, that's right by the shore. Those are people's homes. And you see not just the people die or get injured, your homes are usually destroyed. Look at the vegetation, crops. Filipinos are very active in planting crops and agriculture. That was gone. Animals had died, livestock had died everywhere. Next, please. Again, transportation, really your whole country shuts down with these issues. It is horrific what happened. Next, please. And yet, ironically, when I was working in the Arctic a couple of years ago and doing a research sabbatical there and then working as a nurse in the Arctic, who do I run into? But hundreds of Filipino migrants who are now one of the main sources of workers in the Arctic. So their country is much more stable than the Marshall Islands is with environmental security issues, but it is environmentally vulnerable. There's no question. In the Philippines, it does impact their economy, impacts potential for their workers and their residents. So they often go and serve as migrant workers all over the world. They are literally in the Arctic. I worked with them along with Tongans, Laotians, Cambodians, some Vietnamese. It was just and Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, because climate impacts human migration, not just from a push factor to send people away. It's melting things. It's a pull factor to draw people in for economic opportunities in areas we didn't used to have a lot of people. The circumpolar North and Antarctica have tended to have very few people, if any, but now with climate change and thawing, more workers internationally are coming to these polar areas for climate pull factors. Are getting high salaries as laborers, and it's fascinating. And that was up on the North Slope and one of the little native villages that I worked in, and you see a lot of international workers. Next, please. So it is amazing. You will see a lot of these Asian Pacific Islander and others from around the world working in all parts now of the globe. So again, I ask you to pay attention. They are already here. Next, please. When I worked in Iowa, there were over 180 different languages. Iowa, for those of you that are Canadian, may not have been to Iowa. It's relatively, not all, relatively homogenous rural farm state. Now it's got some of the biggest levels of diversity in the country. It's being driven by the need for laborers. They are being recruited from around the world. And that is Antarctica. When I was there this past year, the workforce in Antarctica is made up heavily of these same populations that are being pulled out of economically deprived and environmentally vulnerable areas. They're getting high salaries in these parts of the world that are now melting. And companies are looking at oil, gas, fisheries, tourism, and other economic opportunities. So it's a crazy place out there. Next, please. And with that, I will just, on the other slide coming up here, if I could, please, just want to wrap up. Be aware that there are lots of different opportunities for you to get involved. There are challenges for these populations when they come into our host communities. They often need pretty significant cross-cultural services. Again, the case of Iowa, 100 different languages. That's hard to pull off in a small, underserved rural state. Lots of disparities, potential for brain drain back home. And yet we find that these populations are terrific. They can help fill urgently needed labor shortages, new partners for growth, revitalization of dying towns, dying schools, dying churches, and other groups that need more population. Countries are looking at them as a new source of tax revenue. They need workers. So with that, I think there's a concluding slide, and this will lead right into Marty's gig here. These are some of the strategies you can be thinking about within Rotary. Make sure that we're paying attention to rapidly changing demographics. This is happening everywhere around us. Efforts to mitigate climate change can help stem some of this migration, reworking international law definitions for migrants and climate refugees, potentially pairing declines in fertility and the need for labor with these folks in certain countries, sustainable development efforts, global social equity, and focusing on the human impacts of climate change, not just on infrastructure damage, but what happens to humans impacted by climate change. So my contact information is on the last slide. And I think Marty is going to follow up here now and talk about some of your opportunities within Rotary. And I'm very willing to continue to meet with you and assist you, or you can contact me privately and we can talk more. So thank you, folks. I'll turn it over to Marty.
Well, first, I'm going to thank you, Michele. And it's great to see you again. And it makes such an impact on everybody when we see these slides. So thank you so much for sharing your world vision with us once again in the wide world of Rotary.
Great to see you. Thank you, Diane.
Great. I'm going to ask Eileen Rao now to introduce Marty.
Good. Thank you very much, Ingrid. Good evening, everyone. It is just so great to see so many wonderful faces from Zone 28, Zone 32, and from, it seems like what I'm looking at, from everywhere. So this is wonderful. We are very honored to have Foundation Trustee Marty Helman with us tonight. Marty is from District 7780, which includes the southern part of the state of Maine and part of the state of New Hampshire. Marty and I go way back to the days when we were first selected to join the governor track in our respective districts. We are the 2012-2013 peace governors who worked with then President Tsukuji Tanaka, whose presidential theme was peace through service. Marty is a great fundraiser and urged her fellow governor classmates to support the Tsukuji Tanaka Rotary Peace Fellowship, which raised $1 million for the Rotary Peace Centers. Marty has been very involved in the Peace Centers and was instrumental in the development of the new Peace Center in the Middle East. They say you meet good friends in Rotary, and I'm very happy to say I met a lifelong friend. Please welcome Marty Helman.
I'm afraid we're going to have to go with that. I apologize for that. I'm here at One Rotary Center. No jokes about Rotary and computerization, please. And let me start by saying that I am more frequently asked to speak on peace than I am on the environment. I am absolutely no expert. And following an amazing individual like Michele, and after that wonderful introduction from my classmate Eileen, I feel like I'm here on false pretenses. But that said, it is increasingly clear to me that there can be no peace without environmental stability and that the two are inextricably linked. So my job tonight is clear, even if I'm not. It's to bring you up to date on what Rotary is doing and is poised to do to respond to the realities of human migration and other environmental crises. And when I say what Rotary is doing, of course, well, I mean what you and I are doing as Rotarians. There's no big monolithic Rotary out there getting projects done. It's just you and me and our individual clubs and districts working, trying to make the world a greener, more harmonious place in which to live. So with that introduction, let me begin. And I think it's important to recognize that the environmental area of focus, which we've had now for a couple of years, that it represents something radically new in Rotary. And that's because the first 6 areas of focus were a response to areas of interest that Rotarians were already investing in. To take you back in the history of the thing, about 15 years ago, the Committee of Rotarians that was looking at what we now call Future Vision, which is our current global grant model, what they did is they took a look at where Rotarians had been investing in the old matching grant program. The committee took the most popular of those areas, overlaid them with the UN millennial goals so that we'd have some consistency in what we were measuring. And voila, that's how the original 6 areas of focus were developed out of what Rotarians were already doing. But the environmental area of focus is something completely different. It's what Rotarians asked for. It's what Rotarians said, we need to be working in this area, even though we're not quite sure what it is we ought to be doing. Now, it's certainly true that Rotarians have been doing environmental work via the other areas of focus, but creating the environmental area of focus with environmental goals as measurement was a recognition that this is work we need to emphasize, that we need to invest in the 21st century. And it was also a recognition that even though Rotarians don't necessarily know today in 2024 what the local solutions might be to the issues of climate change and desertification and human migration, that we can learn by doing. And learn by doing while the world is changing around us, as Michele said, at warp speed. And I think we're already getting things done. As my data is as of January 1st, that is the first 6 months of the current Rotary year. And this year alone, the first 6 months, Rotarians have committed to 65 humanitarian grants in the environment and in an additional 58 environmental global grant scholars. As I mentioned in my talk last September, 1/3 of the spending has been on those scholars. That's a huge percentage of the environmental area of focus going to education, and a cost that's at a much higher percentage than our scholarships in the other areas of focus. So we're investing for the future. And moreover, the numbers of all are increasing in the environmental area. We invested $1.9 million in environmental global grants in 2022. In fiscal 2022. In fiscal 2023, that number had jumped to $3.3 million, and it looks like a nice increase this year as well. Now, so we are doing things, and we are doing more of them. Now, what does all this have to do with human migration and the issues that Michele outlined? Well, as she says, today's geopolitical situation can be read through a lens of environmental sustainability. She talked about migration. The fact is that the world's hotspots are invariably in places undergoing severe climate change. We tend to call it ethnic conflict, or as she said, economic migration. It's often really a conflict over resources that are resulting from climate change. This was brought home to me just before the pandemic. I was involved in a simple grant in India, which was to build a series of check dams. This was the idea was to hold back the water after the monsoon season. It used to be that there was enough water that there would be water in the dams for 8 or 9 months of the year. Then with desertification, it had fallen to 2 or 3 months out of the year. So in order to keep the land green and fertile, the animals fed, people at home where they should be, not forced to migrate to India's already overcrowded cities, the idea was to build a whole series of small dams down the river, check dams, to hold the water back. And this, of course, is all to avoid unemployment and negative situations in India's already overcrowded cities. Or think about the American immigration issues. If you listen to the news, you'd think that immigration starts at the southern border. And of course, as Michele has pointed out, it starts when people feel forced to leave their homes. So what we call immigration is really a migration issue. Again, in my work with literacy in Guatemala, I have visited lush, beautiful green valleys where agriculture is everywhere and malnutrition is a constant, because it turns out that the vegetables grown there in those valleys are all for export. They end up in our supermarkets, while the men and women who do the labor of growing and harvesting the vegetables have nothing to feed their children. So grant projects that turn monoculture into something else, that give those families an opportunity to have even kitchen gardens for their children, is something that we can do. Now, I'll come back to this issue later, but for now, in terms of migration, the time I've spent in Guatemala over the past 2 decades has convinced me that basically a young person in that country today essentially has 3 choices. Choice 1 is to watch his or her family slowly starve to death. Choice 2 is join the get-rich-quick drug trade. And choice 3 is travel 1,000 or more miles across the desert to a country where they know they're not wanted and where they know they will be underpaid and exploited for the work they do. And the point is that it's desperation, it's climate change, it's that's driving people to our southern border. And the Rotary response is already in place, even though we call it literacy or child maternal health or economic development. It's all those things. It is so much more. Now, another point of naming environment as an area of focus is that we have the opportunity to develop projects with some remarkable partners. And just in the past few months, since Michele and I met in Anchorage, the Rotary Foundation has signed an MOU with the United Nations Environment Program, known by its acronym UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. The plan is to combine the expertise of UNEP, the knowledge of our own cadre, plus 1.2 million Rotarians as foot soldiers, to unleash both small and large projects that target cleanup of rivers, lakes, and other freshwater sources. And the first such project is already underway in Africa. As I say, the UNEP relationship can mean simple projects such as river cleanups and awareness campaigns, or they can be more involved and intentional, involving perhaps ongoing monitoring and evaluation of watershed health, site-based action on the causes of freshwater degradation, or citizen monitoring and reporting to national databases on water conditions. It'll be up to us as Rotarians to decide whether we want to follow up on the UNEP relationship and how we want to do it. I find this to be very exciting news, and even more exciting is that some of our Rotarians didn't wait for Rotary and UNEP to get together in order to take action. And in District 7210 in New York's Hudson Valley, a remarkable urban environmental restoration project is underway. A little background, like agricultural Guatemala, Hudson Valley may seem at first glance to be a healthy green space. However, no surprise, there are many small communities along the river that have suffered over the decades from industrial pollution. And of course, these coincide with communities where disadvantaged people and people of color tend to reside. So in response, the Rhinebeck Rotary Club has put together an innovative global grant that starts with a series of community outreach programs to build environmental awareness. This will be followed both by training and by planting programs. Over 2 years, the goal is to build a team of 50 community leaders and the skills to maintain 3,000 pollinator plants, 300 rain garden plants, 200 shoreline stabilization plants, plus shade and fruit trees. So it's a huge, huge project. And at the same time, they will be working through training and education to increase environmental awareness and justice throughout the Hudson Valley communities impacted. All this is thanks to the Rhinebeck Rotary Club and to PDG Lewis Turpin, who is leading the way with this global grant. All that said, I think there's a tendency for us who live in Canada and the US to think of human migration as a problem of the global South, as a problem that takes place over there. So I'd like to bring it home. I've already spoken about how the issues at our own border start in Guatemala and India and other countries. But I think it's critical that we take responsibility for just how much our activities here in the developing world affect and damage the ecosystem. And I apologize, I don't have the stats for Canada. I'm speaking today of the United States. We are, of course, the wealthiest country on the planet with the highest GDP. We make up 5% of the world's population. We account for 20% of resource usage. Of course, we have our love affair with automobiles, but it's much bigger than that. Consider our diet. Every time we choose beef and dairy, we're choosing a food source that is simply worse for the environment, both because of methane production and because of the amount of land required to grow and feed cattle. But even our choices of fruits and vegetables can be suspect. I'm old enough to remember growing up with the idea of summer vegetables and winter vegetables, and you ate what was available at the local market. Today, if I take a hankering for strawberry shortcake or fresh asparagus, even though it's January, I expect to be able to find those ingredients in my local supermarket. I may complain about the high cost to my wallet, but I seldom think about the high cost to the environment of growing those vegetables and transporting them all the way from goodness knows, Mexico or Philippines to Boothbay Harbor, Maine. True fact, the average food items on a US grocery shelf have traveled 1,500 miles, which is probably farther than most US families go on their annual vacation. True fact, the US agricultural sector consumes about 400 gallons of oil per person per year. That's 17% of our nation's energy use. So the next time you see an electric car in the parking lot at Whole Foods, think about it. True fact, we have perfectly clean drinking water coming out of the tap in the US and Canada, which is a remarkably astonishing luxury for the vast majority of the world's population, which is in need of potable water. Yet go into a restaurant and you'll be asked if you want to drink water that can be bottled as far away as France or Fiji. True fact, those of you who see me on Facebook know that as a trustee, my carbon footprint is pretty obnoxious. And so is the amount of time I spend in airports. So I've been looking in those trash bins of those airports lately, and the amount of single-use plastic from Starbucks and McDonald's is simply horrifying. Now, why am I detailing all this? Because another significant difference between the environmental area of focus and the original 6 is that we can no longer say that global grants solve problems in other parts of the world, including, of course, the global South. In the environmental area of focus, to remind you of the immortal words of the comic strip Pogo, we have met the enemy and they are us. Of course, we have work to do overseas, work to put solar panels on the roofs of school buildings in countries like Lebanon, where the power grid is non-existent. Yes, we need to support kitchen gardens in countries like Guatemala, where children are malnourished because the dollar value of exporting food precludes growing food for the home market. But while we are at it, we must never forget that the environmental problems of the developing world and those of the developed world are inextricably linked. That if we want to do something about human migration, if we want to do something with the environment, we can start with thinking more carefully about the foods we choose for dinner. The environmental area of focus is giving us the tools we need to make a sustainable difference, starting right here at home, to educate consumers, very much starting with ourselves, to be more thoughtful about our choices and the carbon footprint we create, to thank the good Lord that our municipal systems provide us with clean water, and to avoid bottled water and other carbon and plastic-laden alternatives, to get serious about finding ways to lower our consumption, and to remember that recycling is a mitigating tool. It is not the goal. But we are Rotarians, we can rise to the challenge, and I thank you very much for your attention.
I'd like to finish with a call to action. Let us reaffirm our commitment to Rotary's peace-building work by creating opportunities to empower individuals to be active, influential agents of peace wherever we may be. Thank you and good night.